Seid begrüßt on behalf of the Jewish Labour Bund in Melbourne. Welcome to our panel for today on the theme, the SKIFist I Wish I Had Met. My name is Reyzl Zylberman and I will be hosting this event today. Some of us have memories of the SKIFisten that we have met in our lifetimes, but there are some chaverim that helped shape who we are that we never got to meet. There are chaverim we admire, chaverim we wish we could ask questions of, and chaverim we just wish we could high five. Today we have 8 special guest panelists who will tell us which SKIFist they wish they had met. But we did give them a challenge, as each guest speaker has just 5 minutes in which to do this, which is of course no easy feat. Our special guests for today are Professor Jack Jacobs, who's joining us from the United States in the very early hours of the morning, Magdalena Kowalska, who is joining us from Poland, and from Melbourne we have Alex Chorowicz, Rose Blustein, Mia Borowitz, Elisa Gray, Onella Stagoll, and Joe Tiggle. Our first speaker for today is Alex Chorowicz. Alex is a historian of the 20th century, specializing in economic, political, and social history. He graduated from the University of Melbourne with a Masters of History in 2015. Since then, he has lectured and taught history, political science, and business at the University of Melbourne, RMIT, and the Singapore Institute of Management. He has published on Australian and British labour history, Australia's relationship with Israel, and American foreign policy depicted in Star Trek: The Next Generation. He is currently teaching at the London School of Economics and is undertaking a doctorate at the University of Oxford. His thesis is on social democratic political thought in interwar Poland, in interwar period. Sorry, one-track mindset. He was at SKIF for 13 years, 10 as a SKIFist and 3 as a helper. Alex.
All right, thank you for the kind introduction, Reyzl. So the person who I chose is a little bit of a cheat because he was not a SKIFist, but he was the first secretary of the organization and had a huge part in shaping what it became. So his name is Lev Hodes, and he was born in the Russian Empire in what is now Belarus. And he moved to Vilna in 1908, where he became a teacher, and that's, I think, where he joined the Bund. He was in the left-wing faction called the Tzveya, and one of the reasons why I was attracted to him is because actually my grandfather, when he was in Zukunft in the interwar period, was in the same faction, in which he embarrassingly told me once in his 80s, and that they used to secretly watch propaganda films of the Soviet Union in their little factional friendship groups. Anyway, that's a side note. So yes, he was very influential in starting SKIF, and he was very, very interested in the role of children in politics and the role of children in building a workers' movement in interwar Poland and having them be a part of what became a big the counterculture the Bund was creating. He had a very incredible life. He actually escaped Poland just before the Nazis invaded and made his way to New York. And he was also very involved in the Bund in New York and became an outspoken critic of Zionism and was a big pamphleteer and writer. So he had a whole bunch of roles, but obviously his role in creating SKIF really interested me. And I have some really beautiful quotes from him about what he thought SKIF should do. And when writing about, he wrote this article in which he outlines what he thinks SKIF's objective should be. And he says, to give young souls the spirit of protest against the injustice of the present day world order. It needs to cultivate the feelings of collectivism and solidarity, plant love and piety towards the heroes and leaders of the workers. So obviously that is a high five worthy quote. And I think what I would love to ask them, and I'm obviously a big history nerd, is I would love to really ask them about what the role of children is in politics, why they're so important in building a movement, because he was incredibly interested in that. And also then I would just like to ask him like broader questions about what his thoughts are about the Russian Revolution. He would have definitely had some really interesting thoughts about that. And also for my own entirely selfish reasons about my PhD, I would have also asked him questions about other European socialist movements, in which he had actually very strong opinions about, because he was quite critical of the big socialist parties in Germany and Austria. I think he thought they were quite centrist and conservative because he was in the left-wing faction. So I think he is an incredible character. I think my 5 minutes is almost up, but I will leave you with a beautiful quote that he wrote after the war. And he said that the idea of the Bund is a deeper belief in people. So that's a person who I would like to meet.
Thank you, Alex. Shane Dank. Lovely to hear about Levi Kodes for sure. Our second speaker for today is Onella Stagoll, OAM. Onella grew up with the Bund and SKIF. Her parents were pre-war Bundisten in Warsaw, then Russia, where Onella was born, and finally Melbourne in 1948. She became a SKIFist in 1954 and a Helfer in the early 60s. Sundays were devoted to Yiddish and SKIF. Shalom Aleichem School in the morning, where she taught until the 60s, Wax House in the afternoon, and of course summers were SKIF camp. She married Brian, her husband, 50 years ago, and they have been involved in labour, health and community politics and the dream of socialism ever since. Onella.
Anella's on mute.
Onella, I think your microphone's on mute.
Okay, are we right now?
Perfect.
Okay, so the person I'm going to speak about is not in fact a SKIFist, or he might have been, but I think his greatest claim to fame and the way what I knew about him was that he was a Zukunftist. Now I was born into the Bund as and SKIF, and I grew up with this history. But a little part of the history that belonged to my uncle, Hein Kirchensweig. He is a SKIFist I want to ask questions of. I did know him, but he died when I was 7. So that's him on his bike. Next is a picture of, as many of you will recognise, Henrik Ehrlich, who was the leader of the Bund at a 1933 May Day demonstration in Warsaw. Chaim is standing just to our right of him, just at the bottom of his sleeve, or so family legend has it, most likely as a bodyguard. Chaim, born in Warsaw, was 22 at the time, and he was a Vizekommandant of the Zukunftssturm, the Bund militia, protecting Jews against anti-Semitism. In 1929, he rode his bicycle through mountainous country to rescue the leader of the Zukunftssturm, Bernhard Goldstein, from an assassination attempt. I would like to ask Chaim about Ehrlich, Goldstein and May Day. Is that really you, Chaim, in the photo? Chaim was a tailor, a member of the Garment Workers Union and an enthusiastic bike rider. Here he is among the cycling group at the National Zukunft Convention in 1932. Notice how all the cyclists are wearing pantaloons. Chaim would regularly cycle from Warsaw to Lodz and back as a courier for Zukunft. When the war broke out, Chaim, with his wife Paula, his brother David, fled Warsaw for Vilna. Here they are with their Chavayren Bundisten on a hill overlooking Vilna. You can tell the two brothers were tailors. Look how stylishly everybody's dressed. Chaim, of course, is wearing his cycling pantaloons. A family story is that when in September of 39, Ehrlich was in hiding, Chaim made a winter coat for him. Ehrlich was wearing that coat when he was arrested and sent to Russia. Along with Victor Alter, we know he was murdered by Stalin around 1942. I would like to ask Chaim about the coat story. Is it true? Now, this is a picture of the Bundists in Shanghai. Chaim, David and Paula escaped from Vilna with visas from the Japanese diplomat Sugihara. In April 1949, they travelled through Moscow on, 41. They travelled through Moscow on the Trans-Siberian Railway to Vladivostok, then Kobe, and finally Shanghai. Here is a photo of a group of the Bundists in Shanghai. Chaim, his brother David, Paula, my cousin baby Victor, who was born there. In 1944, the Japanese confined the Jews to the Hongqiu ghetto. Chaim was among a group who resisted the move and were imprisoned in the Wardrobe prison. The Wardrobe prison, which was known as the famous Alcatraz of the Orient. Protesting against prison conditions, he organised a hunger strike. The question I have is, did the hunger strike succeed? Now this is the picture of the boat on which they left Shanghai. Chaim and his family left by boat and arrived in Australia in 1947. He helped establish Melbourne Zukunft in 1949, and I understand that it was the Melbourne Zukunft that was very much involved in the establishment of SKIF in Melbourne. Unfortunately, he died very young at the age of, in 1953, when he was only in his early 40s. He's buried in Melbourne Cemetery, very close to where Jacob Wax is. I'd like to ask Chaim about his involvement in the formation of SKIF. Now, this is not Chaim, this is me holding a teddy bear. I came to Australia in 1948 with my parents, and on the way here we stopped in New York, where Victor Ehrlich, Henrik Ehrlich's son, gave me a teddy bear, and I still have it. And I would have liked to ask Chaim if he remembers this little bear. Now, Chaim loved to sing. Today, I like to think he would sing with me the Jugendhymn, which was written by Shmerke Kataginski. Now, I'm only going to sing the refrain, so don't panic there, Reyzl, sorry. Now. Jung ist jeder, wer es will noch. Jung haben kein Bartheit. Alte kennen euch sein Kinder in a neue freie Zeit. Now, the special words from this song, which I'll say both in Yiddish and English for tonight, are Ewig wollen wir verbinden, unser Nächten mit dem Heid. Wherever we will bind our future to our past. Kavashat.
Thank you, Onella. Shainem Dunk. Our next speaker is Mia Borowitz. Mia is a self-professed lover of all things Yiddish, SKIF and Bund. Mia has studied Yiddish for many years, having attended Shalom Aleichem College. She completed VC Yiddish in 2019. After several years as a SKIFist, Mia became a helper at the beginning of 2020, and she can't wait to tell you about the SKIFist she wishes she had met. Mia.
Thank you very much, Reyzl. Shalom Aleichem, everyone. When I received the invitation to speak on this panel, I was absolutely thrilled and excited, but I also found it extremely challenging to choose one SKIFist I wish I could have met. Throughout my years of SKIF, I've had the opportunity to learn about so many brave and influential SKIFisten, but upon reflection, one SKIFist who stood out to me in particular was Davidhofberg. It's a given that if you've attended SKIF over the past 70 years, you too are familiar with this name. But before I delve into the heroic actions synonymous with Davidl's legacy, I want to talk about his background and involvement with SKIF. Davidl was born on the 19th of July 1925 in Siedlec, Poland. His father was a former yeshiva bocher who later became a bookkeeper, and his mother Dina taught at Tigel school in Siedlec. At the end of the 1920s, she moved with Davidl to Warsaw, where she started teaching at the Banish Michalewicz School, which was then run by the Bund. I see many parallels between Davidl's sense of character as well as his upbringing and my own. Like myself, Davidl attended a secular Jewish primary school and was considered to be outgoing, and intelligent, athletic, as well as serious and strong-willed. He was involved with the Bund from a very young age, and similar to Habbo's attempts in recruiting myself, Davidl was also approached by several Zionist groups. However, these attempts to lure Davidl to the other side were futile. He was a staunch SKIFist with an inviolable dedication to the Bund's ideals. His embodiment of Chavashaft was exemplified by a small act of kindness during a Kreisweek trip to the movies. The story goes that there weren't enough seats in the movie theatre, so Davidl let Simcha Blustein sit on his lap. What a bloke, am I right? Yeah. Davidl's devotion to SKIF and the Bund continued despite the rise of Nazism and the eventual Nazi occupation of Warsaw in September 1939. It was at this point in which Davidl and his mother Dina joined the underground Bund organization. What is astonishing to me is that at this time, Davidl would have only been 14 years old. And furthermore to this, it was only 3 years later when he joined the ZOB, and he was barely even 17. In April 1943, he was actually one of the youngest commanders, younger than myself, which is just astounding. In the first week of fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, Davidl's unit was stationed near the corner of Zika and Miller Street. Marek Edelman later recorded that Davidl and Derek Schneidelmail and their units led hundreds of Jews from a burning bunker to safety in a second bunker further down the street. On the 27th of April, the Nazis discovered the fighters' bunker located at 29 Miller Street and attacked. Almost instinctively, Davidl handed over his gun to his best friend and wedged his body in the entrance. This ultimate sacrifice gave time for 5 fighting units and hundreds of Jewish civilians to retreat to a safer position. Davidl was a martyr, a hero of our people, and a young man whose actions truly epitomized SKIF's core beliefs. He was barely my age, yet he will inspire me for the rest of my life, and all of us, I'm sure. If I had the opportunity to have met him, to be honest, I'm not sure what I'd ask or what I'd say, but I know that it'd be the ultimate privilege simply just to hear about his love of the Bund and his views towards the world and life. Ashein Dank everyone for listening.
Ashein Dank Mia. Our next speaker, Rose Blustein, has held positions in a number of government and public libraries for over 35 years. As manager of the Braille and Talking Book Library, she was instrumental in delivering an innovative library service to blind and vision impaired users. Rose has also held senior management positions with the Aboriginal Family Violence Prevention and Legal Service, Foundation House, Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture, and Breast Screen Victoria. Her contribution in the Jewish community includes teaching at Shalom Aleichem Sunday School and presenting a Yiddish program on Radio 3ZZZ. Rose.
Dank. Guten Abend. Before I talk about the SKIFist I wish I had met, I need to disclose that I knew this Bund hero well. He was a close friend of our family. His father and my maternal grandfather worked together in the Bund in Lodge, and my mother and he spent most of their childhood together at school and at SKIF. I am, of course, talking about Bonner Wiener, a man larger than life to a small child. As I grew to know him as an adult, I began to appreciate the impact he must have had as a youth and young man in pre-war Poland and then during the terrible war years. Simcha Binem Wiener, known to all of us as Bonner, was born in Lodz in 1920 to a middle-class Bundes family. He was a member of SKIF from an early age and was committed to the socialist ideals of the Bund and the advancement of the Yiddish language. He attended the Bundist Madame Secular Jewish School and a Jewish technical college where he learnt metalwork. He was 9 years old when he joined SKIF. He was later elected to the SKIF board and became its president. He was taught to believe in peace and justice for all and friendship between people. When the Germans invaded Lodz in September 1939, Bonner and his parents were incarcerated in the Lodz ghetto. Bonner's brother Pincher had been conscripted into the Polish army. He soon became a leader of the Bundist underground movement. He secretly kept half a radio receiver in a canteen. The other half was hidden in a canteen of his good friend, Abraham Goldberg, and he listened to the illegal BBC radio. When the ghetto was liquidated in August 1944, Bonner was one of the 800 who were required to remain behind, as his metalworking skills were deemed vital to the Nazis. Bonner, however, refused to abandon his Aunt Clara, his last remaining relative in the ghetto. Both his parents had died by then, and left with her in a transport heading to Auschwitz. His aunt was murdered shortly after their arrival. Bonner survived beatings and other torture while in Auschwitz. At the war's end, he was reunited with Pincher, who survived most of the war in a Russian camp for political prisoners. The brothers returned to Lodz and stayed there for 3 years. The first thing Bonner did on his return was dig up his buried archives. He managed to find only one of his 2 hidden boxes. The next thing he did was he tried to resurrect Jewish life and the Bund, but the few Bundisten who returned to Lodz were disillusioned with life in Poland. However, his enthusiasm and determination led to a Zukunft camp in August 1946, where for 2 weeks, over 200 men and women in their 20s came together. Bonner's efforts to rebuild Jewish life in Poland came to an abrupt end when the communists gained control and demanded that the Bund and other socialist parties give up their identities. It was time to get out. Bonner and Pincher escaped to Germany and, assisted by the International Refugee Organization, migrated to Australia in 1950, where the brothers worked on the Snowy Mountains scheme. Bonner's fighting spirit and commitment to the ideals of Bund never left him. Not long after his arrival in Melbourne, he became involved in communal life. He was the secretary of the Bund from 1954 to 58 and later its president. He also became an active member of the Australian Labour Party. Among other achievements was his strong support to free Soviet Jews. From 1960 to 1970, he was a member of the Board of Jewish Welfare, now called Jewish Care. He was president of the Kadima and co-founded the Jewish Holocaust Museum. He was also heavily involved in the establishment of the Shalom Aleichem Day School. Bonner was everyone's friend, a close friend to hundreds of people. His friends remember him as a man of passion and conviction, who sometimes let his emotions overrule his judgment. To me, he was a true hero. Adank.
A shame of Dank, Rose. I think we could have a whole category of the people we wish we had met when they were skifisted. Definitely Bonner would fall into that category. Our next speaker is Joe Tiggle. Joe has a history of contribution in various roles within Melbourne's Yiddish organisations, including the Kedima, Shalom Aleichem College, and the Jewish Labour Bund. Joe is the Vice President of the Kedima and has been involved with the Kedima in a variety of roles for many years. Joe's father, Shia, was a stalwart of Yiddish theatre with the Davidhofberg Theater. Joe has continued in this tradition and has performed on the Yiddish stage in a variety of roles. Joe is co-chair of the In One Voice Festival, which is co-presented by the Kedima and SKIF. Joe was a SKIFist and a helper at SKIF in Melbourne, and he's a member of the Jewish Labour Bund. Joe.
Thank you, Reyzl. That's quite the resume, and appreciate the introduction. And dare I say, says Amis Machaya Dot Zayn, and an honour to boot. So the SKIFist that I would have loved to have met is Marek Edelman. And I'm going to go a different path with Marek and not necessarily talk about his heroic involvement in the ghetto Aufstand during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, but more about why he inspired me as a SKIFist and some of the things that I would have liked to learn from him. So in history, you sometimes look back over the fence that came before you, or the area, the space that came before you. And when I was growing up as a SKIFist, as Marek Edelman did, I was imbued with the spirit of Zusammenbauen unserer Kinderrepublik. That was the thing that inspired me as a SKIFist, and it was drummed into me that we are joining something as a collective where we're going to take on the world. And certainly the world for young Marek Edelman as an 18 to 20-year-old, because his actual date of birth, if you look at different sources, suggests he was born somewhere between 1919 and 1921. So as an 18 to 20-year-old, we all know that his world turned upside down. He was a very active member of SKIF. He went through the sort of maturing process as a SKIFist, then to Zukunft and on to the Bund. Again, very similar to my journeys a few decades later. And he was schooled in a vision for a socialist world that stood for the worker, that stood for justice, and faced the evil winds with pride and with strength. As a young Bundist, he was quoted as saying that Bundisten warten nicht auf Mashiach. They're not going to wait for the Messiah to make the world a better place. They're going to do it themselves. They're going to take it on. So as the war enveloped Poland in 1939, and a young Marek Edelman was forced into a corner of the ghetto that was originally designed for about 20,000 inhabitants and was then filled to nearly 450,000. One can only imagine what that fear, uncertainty, the question around fate would have meant for individuals. So my question to Marek would have been, how do you consider and make life choices amongst such poor ones that are obvious to you, where you don't have a warm home to run back to, parents' arms to secure you, the sorts of comforts that we take, especially when we look at a world that challenges us, we can run home and be secure. What was that like for someone as a young person to have to galvanise his friends and then take on the world? And so we know that he was very active during the Aufstand, his role in the ZOB, and the fact that he was one of the very few that survived the uprising and went on to live a long, fulfilling life in Poland with further challenges after the war. But where we all know Marek to be a hero was that as all was dying around him and the Germans were looking to liquidate the ghetto, in his words, after all, humanity had agreed that dying with arms was more beautiful than without arms. All it was about ultimately was that we not just let them slaughter us when our turn came, it was only a choice as to the manner of dying. And again, we know against the odds that dying was the most obvious outcome, but they did it with defiance. And they wouldn't let the Nazis defeat them without showing their pride and dignity through that process. And that's where, you know, we fortunate here living in what we call the lucky country, while we don't have to face those sorts of choices, we have to honour and respect that it was only through those sorts of acts that we become better Jews and we build a better world. So in belonging to the Bund, that's where the honour comes, that we're part of something so much bigger, and that in a world where people again are being abused, we see it every day in the press that there's still racism, that people are being abused from the highest echelons, and I won't mention the person that drives me the craziest in today's world, but I'm so proud that I'm still carrying on some of those traditions to different degrees or to different challenges, but being part of a movement that sought to change the world. And in finishing, there's one comment that Magdalena made, and again, if it's a mantra for my life, I would certainly love to adopt it, and that is, hate is easy, but love requires effort. Schönen Dank und Vaterschaft.
Schönen Dank, Jozef. It gives me great pleasure to welcome our next speaker to her first ever event with the Jewish Labour Bund in Melbourne, Magdalena Kowalska. Magdalena holds a PhD in Jewish studies. Her dissertation investigated the role of the Zukunft organization among Jewish youth in interwar Poland. She holds an MA from Jagiellonian University's program in Jewish studies and an MA in cultural studies from the same university. She has been awarded several scholarships, among others by YIVO Institute of Jewish Research and Vilnius University. Her scholarly interests range from the history of the Bund to the question of Orientalization and the problems of modern Israel. She serves as a member of the board of the Polish Association for Yiddish Studies and a member of the editorial board of In Geweb. You can now purchase her book on the history of Zukunft, which was first published in 2016 in English translation. Magdalena.
Okay, thank you very much, and I'm very happy I could be with you here. That's a good side of COVID crisis, that we could meet online on this event, and I could join you. Actually, the book is in the process of translation, so you can buy the book in Polish and in English soon. So I'm glad I didn't choose Mara Gedelman. That was my first choice, but then I thought, okay, maybe I should choose someone who also was linked with Australia. So I actually chose a person who I met, but I'm not the only one who did so I'm happy. I chose Jozef Bergner, a painter who for some time was living in Australia and then moved to Israel and passed away sadly some time ago, a couple of years ago, and I had a great privilege to talk to him a couple of times, but I wish I could speak to him more. So I will tell you now about him and maybe the role of art in raising important social issues. So another approach we could take as the followers of SKIFists. So Jozef Bergner was born in 1920 in Vienna as the son of the great Yiddish poet Melech Ravitch and the singer Fanny Herrstein. But then they moved with their family to Poland, to Warsaw. And Jozef Bergner, actually his real name was Vladimir Jozef Bergner, but then he himself chose to use only Jozef because he felt so much connected with Goles that he didn't want to use the international Vladimir name. So they moved to Warsaw, and they lived in Warsaw till 1937, when they moved to Melbourne, he was attending Yiddish Volksschule, like most of the folks we were talking about. And then he was a SKIFist and Zukunfist, and it had a great impact on his future life and on his view on society, on his worldview. As a young adult, he was portraying misfits, and still living in Poland, he was drawing people who were not really fitting to the society as the society would like to see them. When he moved to Australia in 1937, he pursued his painting career. And he actually made a change in a painting movement in Australia, portraying labor workers and indigenous people, which was something very uncommon at the time. Later he moved on to Israel, and with his wife in 1950. He wasn't that well recognized in Israel until the 80s because his works weren't very Zionistic, and they weren't that easy to digest. It's not something you would like to have in your living room. It's more of an art, of a symbolic paintings that make you think about problems of life, inspired by Kafka, by Goya. That's his impact on the change, I think. When I met him, he was it was in 2013. He was still painting, and he was still following the news, and he was very much interested in portraying the crisis, the war crisis in the Middle East. So I would like to ask him now what he thinks about current events, about refugee crisis, and how he would portray that and use art to make the change. I also have some pictures I would want to share with you. Just a second. Okay, why it doesn't work? Okay. Maybe later on I will work on this. Okay, no, maybe now. Do I share my screen now?
Yes, it's working.
Oh yeah, we can see it.
It's working, good. So this is a gift his friends from SKIF and Zukunft gave him before he moved to Australia. It's Vladek in Australia, as you can see, and these are pictures of him, and also I have some pictures of camp in Kuzmir in 1935, and you can see, and also the SKIFist Republic in 1937. So you can copycat that if you'd like. I can provide you the map. Thank you so much.
A Shane Doug Magda, I definitely want a copy of those pictures. We'll talk. Our next speaker is very excited to share with you the SKIFist she wishes she had met. Elisa Gray started in SKIF in 1973 and stayed until 1987 as a SKIFist, Helfer and Vorsitzerin, and some might say she's never left. She is an alumnus of the Shalom Aleichem Sunday School and taught there in her late teens and early 20s. Elisa taught Yiddish and Jewish studies at Shalom Aleichem College for 14 years and has been co-directing school productions there for 20 years. She has performed in Yiddish theatre her whole life since the age of 8, including in Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, Montreal, and New York. Elisa is a card-carrying Bundist. Elisa.
Wow, thank you. That was epic. And thanks for having me on this panel. I'm very excited to be in such amazing company. The SKIFist that I would love to have met is Asya Big. She was born in Vilna, the younger of 2 daughters, in a secular family, and her father wanted her to have a secular Jewish education, so he sent her to a Jewish public school for both primary and high school. Though academic success came very easily to her, her attitude to her studies was always very deep and serious, and she really loved school and was popular amongst students and teachers alike. She went to SKIF as a child until she was 16 and then on to Jugendbund and Zukunft. And this is where her life's ideologies were formed. She was completely enmeshed in the workers' movement from a very young age. She was recognised also as an extremely hard worker and massive contributor, and she considered the members of the Bund her family. When the terrors began in 1939 and they were arresting big machas in the Bund, and she was in the mix there, and it's reported that she never let go of the flag that she was carrying, her Bund flag. But now it meant that the work had to be conducted really in secret, and it was more needed and more desperate than ever. So she continued to work tirelessly, teaching the ideology to young children and teenagers. And when they moved into the Vilna ghetto, she was one of the most prolific and active in the underground Bund. When the ghetto was to be liquidated, they had one last Bund conference to discuss what they wanted to do, who was going to go to join the partisans, who was going to do this, who was going to do that. And Asya and 4 of her friends escaped via the sewers to the German side, where they became separated into 2 groups to find initial hiding places. Avrom Chvoinik, Yankiv Kaplan and Asya were surrounded all of a sudden by Gestapo, and the 3 of them just started to shoot. They had weapons and they were going to use them. And one of the members from the other group that they got separated from, Josef Musnik, watched from the distance in horror. But they did manage to shoot and kill Max Gross, who was a Gestapo research officer who specialised in partisan affairs. But obviously they were overrun, and the 3 of them were arrested and were tortured for the next 24 hours. The next day, which was September the 24th, 1943, the last Jews of Vilna were assembled and forced to watch as the gallows were built. And despite the fact that they'd obviously been tortured, one of the onlookers reported that Asya actually smiled to the crowd and shook her head as she was brought in, and they were hanged, and Asya's last words were "Lang soll leben der Sozialismus." long live socialism. And she died after a few minutes, reportedly with a smile on her face that unnerved her murderers. She was 21. So I knew who Asia Big was from the time I was 8. And when I was growing up in SKIF, we learned about many amazing Bund heroes who were prepared to, and some did, die. They laid down their lives for the cause. And this always made us feel really important because so many of them were so young, which meant that we could be that, we could do that, we could believe that. And, on SKIF camps, we had lots and lots of opportunities through Skeutenspielen and other activities to reenact these adventures of escaping and hiding, concealing information, passing secret coded messages. And I think we all fancied ourselves as heroes too. I really thought at the time that if I were in the same situation, I would do what they did. But I don't know if I would. And that's lucky for me because I live in safety and I have never been put in that position. So hopefully I'll never find out. I've never had to lay down my life for my ideology. So if I had the chance to sit with Asia Big and talk to her, I would just want to be in her presence and feel and understand the depths of her beliefs and the courage of her convictions, and just to be in her aura, in her energy. That would be my wish.
Ashanim dank, Elisa. We have left a very special international guest until last. Professor Jack Jacobs, as I mentioned earlier, is joining us in the very early hours of the morning from the United States, and we're very grateful. Jack Jacobs is Professor of Political Science at John Jay College and the CUNY Graduate Center. He received a PhD from Columbia University and was an Assistant Professor of Political Science at Columbia before coming to John Jay. Professor Jacobs is the author of On Socialists and the Jewish Question After Marx, of Bundes Counterculture in Interwar Poland, one of my favorite books, and of the Frankfurt School Jewish Lives and Anti-Semitism, and the editor of Jewish Politics in Eastern Europe, the Bund at 100, and of Jews and Leftist Politics, Judaism, Israel, Anti-Semitism, and Gender. That's a mouthful. He has delivered academic lectures all over the world, including in Australia. Professor Jacobs was a Fulbright research scholar at Tel Aviv University, a visiting scholar at the Shimon Dubnov Institute for Jüdische Geschichte und Kultur at Leipzig University, the Workman Circle Dr. Emanuel Pat visiting professor at the YIVO Institute for Jewish Research, and was also a Fulbright scholar at Vilnius University. He was the Lewis and Helen Patnos visiting professor at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, during the fall 2016 semester, and the Jacob Cronhill, a familiar name to us in Melbourne, visiting professor at the YIVO Institute in the spring of 2017. During the fall of 2018, he served as a visiting fellow of the British Academy and as an honorary research fellow of the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism, Birkbeck University of London. So, which SKIFist does this scholar of Bund history wish he had met? You're about to find out. Professor Jack Jacobs.
Thanks so much, Reyzl. Thanks for the invitation and thanks for the introduction. I very much appreciate having been asked to be part of this event. First of all, of course, Chavoshaft. The SKIFist I'm going to be speaking about this morning, it is very, very early here. The SKIFist I'm going to be speaking about is Kalman Wapner. Kalman Wapner served as the secretary of the Poland-wide SKIF in the years 1936 to 39. It is to say, in the years immediately preceding the beginning of the Second World War. These were the years in which the SKIF reached the high point of its membership. They were marked by growth and by success, at least some of which may very well have been due to Wapner's leadership. So who was Wapner, and why would I have wanted to meet him? Well, Wapner was born in 1913 into a family which was active in Bundist affairs. Kalman's father, Nachum, made a living working as a bookkeeper for the organized Jewish community of Vilna, the Vilna Kehillah, but he was best known in Bundist circles for his activities on behalf of the secular Yiddishist schools of Vilna. Indeed, Nachum, Kalman's father, was the long-term chair of the Parents' Committee of Vilna's CBK, the Zentrale Bildungskomitee, which was the organization that supported and advocated on behalf of Vilna's Yiddish language schools. Given this family background, it's not at all surprising that Kalman himself attended one of the Yiddish secular elementary schools in his native city, and that when he graduated from this elementary school, he attended Vilna's very famous Reyzl Gymnasia, one of the very small number of gymnasia in Poland in which Yiddish was the primary language of instruction. Kalman became a member of SKIF in Vilna in 1927, which was the year in which SKIF was first established in Vilna. In Vilna, SKIF was made up primarily of school children, rather than of children who were already in the labor force. The bulk of the members of SKIF in Vilna were between 12 and 15, and initially it was modestly sized. SKIF had only 75 members in Vilna in 1930. Kalman was an activist within the local branch of SKIF from the time that he became a member, and he ultimately became a Kreisführer. When Kalman graduated from the Reyzl Gymnasia in 1930, he wanted to pursue additional education, but it was very difficult for Jews to be accepted into Polish universities at that time, and Kalman therefore decided to study abroad and enrolled in the Polytechnium in the city of Caen in France. At one point in 1934, he interrupted his studies, he returned to Vilna, and he threw himself into work on behalf of both SKIF and the Jugendbund Zukunft, becoming a member of the local coordinating committees of both organizations. But he ultimately went back to France, received a degree in engineering, and finished his studies in the depths of the Great Depression. He very much wanted to be an engineer, but at the point that he graduated, he was unable to obtain work in his field. There was no work to be had. And his friends in the movement, the leaders of the movement, asked him to become secretary of the Poland-wide SKIF. This was a position he took over from Emanuel Pat. Wapner was widely acknowledged to be highly qualified for the job and extraordinarily good at it. He knew a great deal about socialist-oriented studies on working with children. He was a very responsible person. He was devoted to the movement, Leben, like we used to say. He was very conscientious. And with Wapner as secretary, SKIF blossomed. SKIF had had something like 3,400 members in 102 local groups in 1931. By the summer of 1939, it had more than 10,000 members in 154 groups throughout Poland. Wapner, who was co-editor of the SKIF's journal, Chaverschaft, and was busy with any number of other projects, considered the Poland-wide SKIF summer camp, which he organized in 1937 and of which he was director, to be one of the high points of his work, and that summer camp was an enormous success. So if I had had a chance to meet Wapner, what would I have asked him? Well, I would have been very interested in how he hoped to continue to expand SKIF. Did he have any plans to incorporate non-Yiddish speaking Jewish children, a growing part of the Jewish population of Poland, into SKIF? And how did he hope to go about integrating kids who had been raised in Yiddish secular schools with kids who received dramatically different educations, or in some cases, hardly any formal education at all? In other words, what I would have wanted to know from the man who was doing it is, so Kalman, how do you explain the success of SKIF, and what do you hope to accomplish down the line? But of course, I never did have a chance to meet Bergner. I'm proud and delighted to say that I knew a couple of the other people who we've spoken about so far in this event, but no, not Bergner, because at the time of the German invasion of Poland, Bergner, who by that point was married, he left Warsaw together with his spouse. He fled east. He made it as far as Vilna. He moved into his parents' home, where he immediately established that home as one of the centers of the underground Bundist youth movement. When the Soviets occupied Vilna in the summer of '40 and began arresting Bundist leaders, Bergner escaped, first to Kovno in independent Lithuania, and later to Riga in Latvia. The Jewish Labour Committee, which was based in New York, succeeded in obtaining entry visas to the US for specific Bundist refugees, and Kalman hoped that he would be able to arrange the necessary paperwork to leave Europe and travel to America while he was in Riga, but he did not succeed. Time ran out. Neither he nor his spouse, Enya, survived the war. But Kalman's great work on behalf of the pre-war SKIF remained widely admired among all those who knew him, and should be a point of pride among SKIFists today. Dank und Fellowship.
Hashem hartlichen Dank, Yankel. From our panelists here today, we have heard about a wonderful mix of individuals and perspectives that all help shape a long history of SKIF, and the individuals who helped make up this movement, not just within their time, but as Professor Jacobs has alluded to, but with the impact they have made on the individuals who came after them. And although we can't meet these individuals in person, we can continue to learn about these individuals, to read about them, and to tell their stories, as we have this evening, or this morning for Professor Jacobs, and in the middle of the day for Magdalena. Hashem Dank to our speakers this evening who shared their thoughts, knowledge, and time with us. And we also thank everyone who has joined us watching from home. Feel free to let us know in the comments on our YouTube page which SKIFist you wish you had met. We would really like to know. Until next time, wir wünschen euch all das Gutes, la mir sich treffen auf Simches und mit Chaverschaft.
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 So.